All right, so welcome. We are kicking off our vSphere 6.5 series tonight, starting off with vCenter Server Appliance 6.5 Part 1. We're joined by Adam Eckerle, who will be presenting. Next slide, please. Some quick show notes. You can join in on the conversation either in the chat GoToMeeting window or via Twitter using the hashtag vBrownBag. Don't forget we have other shows going on globally as well, so check those out. Tonight's presenter is Adam Eckerle. You can find him on Twitter at Eck79. I'm your host, Ahmad Yunus. You can find me on Twitter at Ahmad_Yunus. And with that, I'll turn it over to Adam.
All right, thank you, sir. So as Ahmad mentioned, I work for VMware as well in tech marketing in the CPBU, or the Cloud Platform BU, which is the business unit that owns vSphere. So let's just get right into it. Oh, sorry, one more thing. Sorry, Ahmad, I kind of stealing your thunder here, but I did want to point out the schedule for the series of vBrownBags over the next few weeks, because we're going to kind of be all around vSphere 6.5. Next week, the roles will be reversed. So if Ahmad is mean to me this week, then I get to be mean to him next week, as he kind of talks about vCenter Server Appliance migration. And then we got to find a replacement for HA and DRS. And then Jace McCarty with vSAN, Mike Foley. It's going to be an awesome session on security and VM encryption and all that fun stuff. And then we'll round out the series probably with Kyle talking about APIs and Power CLI. So this week, we're going to talk about vCenter Server 6.5. It's going to be focused around the appliance. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just kind of level setting of what's new. I try to minimize the amount of slides that I have. I think 10 is what I have that we'll go through and just talk about some of the new features. And then I'm going to get out of PowerPoint and we're going to go to the whiteboard and kind of focus on vCenter HA. So we're going to kind of save that to the end. And then, we'll kind of open it up for questions and things. And then Ahmad will be manning the Q&A, as he mentioned at the beginning. So let's jump in. First things first, what's new with the vCenter Server Appliance, right? In 5.1, when we introduced the appliance, and 5.5 and 6.0, it was based on SUSE Linux or SLES. But with 6.5, we've now replaced that with Photon OS. This is a purpose-built Linux distribution that VMware has built. You may have heard it in context of containers. We use it here in the vCenter Server Appliance as a way to make sure that the appliance is running a very specific purpose-built operating system, not a general purpose OS like SLES or even Windows on the Windows installable side. So faster boot times, more efficient operations, better performance. We can do things like turn around security patches much faster because we're not relying on a third party to create those patches and test them and then hand them over to us to do the same. So we're going to see a lot of efficiency here as we're owning the operating system that's running on the appliance. A few more things. I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, but we now have a native high availability solution for vCenter. This is only available for the appliance. And then also a frequently asked question that we get is, does this new vCenter HA require some additional licensing? As long as you have vCenter Server standard licensing, this is an included feature. We don't need, we'll talk more towards the end about active, passive, and witness nodes that make up this solution, but you don't need extra licensing for any of that. It's included in your vCenter Server standard license. Next, we've got Update Manager, which is finally integrated into the appliance. Just to give you some context about how important this one is, this was the single thing at VMworld in Barcelona that got an ovation when it was announced during Ahmad and I's sessions. So people are really excited about this. People had different reasons, but one of the reasons that they didn't move to the appliance was because they still needed a Windows machine to house Update Manager. That has gone away with this release. And Ahmad I'm sure we'll talk about some of this next week, but it's really nice that if you have VUM out on its own Windows server today, even if you're running 5.5 or 6.0, the upgrade to 6.5 will automatically pull that VUM instance right into the appliance. So there's not some messy migration path or a whole bunch of steps and KB articles that you got to figure out and follow. The installer is real nice in that we automatically bring that in and migrate everything over for you right into the vCenter Server Appliance 6.5. Another thing is, a challenge has been, log drives filling up, that feel like the appliance is a black box and don't have the visibility that we need. So one of the things that was a focus on 6.5 and will continue to be a focus going forward, we recognize that we're not done yet, but we're bringing that increased visibility right into the VAMI or the UI, the appliance management UI in the appliance 6.5. So when you log into VAMI, you'll see some new things like CPU metrics, network metrics, database metrics. You'll be able to see some of the different partitions of the database and how full those VMDKs are, and we're going to continue to expand that visibility in the future, and then also expose that data via RESTful APIs. So some cool stuff, and I'm sure Kyle will talk more about the API stuff in a few weeks. So last is native backup and restore. This is a cool feature in that now you don't have to rely on some sort of agent or third party to back up your platform services controllers or vCenter server appliances. Now we have a built-in way to back up that entire configuration to a set of files, and we stream that over a couple different protocols to some sort of destination storage. And then, if our vCenter blows up, we basically just run the installer off the ISO, off the appliance ISO, deploy a brand new vCenter server appliance, and then import that backup data. So it's a pretty cool process. This is very much an initial release for native backup and restore. So things like a scheduler aren't there yet, but this all is exposed via API. So we can do things like write a Power CLI script to automatically back up your vCenter server appliance or your PSC via API, and use some sort of external scheduler to call that script for you. Whether a lot of backup applications like your Commvaults and your backup execs and Avamars, they allow you to run like pre and post scripts. So this is a situation where you could integrate those API calls or that script into an existing backup application, or a backup job. So another way to do it. One of the things that gets asked very commonly is how this compares with a solution like Veeam or any of the others I named previously. The big distinction here is that this native backup and restore solution isn't backing up your VMs. It is only for the vCenter server appliance and PSC appliance. So we're not backing up any of the underlying VMs that are running, right? So clearly those other backup products are adding a lot of value in backing up your actual workloads. So that gets kind of confusing here and there. So just want to make sure that that's clear. So one of the other things that's been greatly improved here is the install experience. So if you've deployed 6.0 or I guess 5, any previous version for that matter, it's kind of a one-shot deal, right? You get the wizard, you put in a bunch of information, and you hit go, right? And the appliance installer does its thing. If we mess up, fat finger an IP address, if we don't have DNS and verse DNS or NTP set up correctly, we're going to get some sort of failure. And then guess what? We got to start all over again. So basically what's been done is we broke this up into 2 stages. Stage one is really about deploying the appliance, the VM, unconfigured from the standpoint of it doesn't have a vCenter or PSC sort of personality yet. We're just deploying a VM with a name, IP address, and the network settings that it needs. And then once that is complete and we're good, then we can move on to stage two, which then configures the node as a vCenter or a PSC, or maybe a vCenter with an embedded PSC, and then we tack on like NTP and a couple of other things. So this affords us a couple of different advantages. One is that when we break it up, if we fail in stage one, we fail faster, right? If we fail in stage two, there are some circumstances where we can actually restart stage two, or even better, if we take a snapshot in between stage one and stage two, and we mess up in stage two, then we could even, just revert to snapshot and just retry stage two. The other neat thing about this is that we also allow you to launch stage two from the VAMI. So let's say you're at work, you're at the office, it's getting close to quitting time. You go ahead and launch the installer, start deploying, go through stage one, and you're like, I'm not going to wait on this, I'm going to get home. So you go home and then get on the VPN, you log back in, and you know that stage one is complete by then. So you just hit the VAMI of the appliance, and the appliance intelligently says, oh, hey, I'm new, I'm not completely configured yet, click this link and I'll complete stage two. And it walks you through, takes in the necessary information and completes right there, from the web interface. So that's kind of neat. And the other thing you've probably noticed from the screen on the bottom there is now the installer really does support multiple operating systems. We don't need some weird plugin, client integration plugin in this case, to launch the installer anymore. So we can run this on Mac, we can run it on Linux. It's neat and dandy, and I think a lot of people enjoy that piece of it. But the GUI is only one way to deploy the vCenter Server Appliance. The other way, which I think both Ahmad and I and quite a few others have taken a liking to, is the CLI install, or the scripted install. This was sort of what we call a tech note or a technical preview in 6.0, but in 6.5 this is fully supported, and we've moved to pretty much doing this exclusively in our labs. Basically, we provide some JSON templates on the ISO, or the installer ISO, and then you customize those templates, and then you run a simple command line to either install, migrate, or upgrade your vCenter with this CLI tool. So it's pretty robust. A lot of work went into this, and it's become one of my favorite tools to use. So if you're deploying machines, deploying vCenters, this is definitely something to look into. Plus, the JSON file gives you kind of a record of how your vCenter was deployed, or your PSC was deployed. So if you ever have questions, or like, oh, how did I do this? You just go back to that JSON file and you can see exactly how you deployed it. Hey, Ahmad, how are we doing on questions?
So we got 3 questions. 2 of them are more related to your whiteboard. So Graham Mitchell wants to know about ESXi over a metro cluster or stretch cluster. I figured you'd cover that over the whiteboard. And I presume we still can't run PowerShell scripts from vCenter alerts.
From vCenter alerts?
Yeah.
Oh, I think I understand the question. So like use when an alert is triggered, automatically execute a script as sort of like a auto remediation type thing, or maybe the script does something else. But
yep,
that's a good question. I don't even know if that's on the radar, to be honest. Ahmad, have you heard any of the PMs talk about?
No, I haven't heard anything yet. I'll double check and we'll get back to you on that one.
Yeah, but that's a great question and a great use case that does come up periodically, and I think it would be a pretty cool feature to add.
Kyle may be the guy also to ping about that as well.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, let's keep trucking. I don't want to waste too much time on questions, and then I don't get through all the content, but we're nearing the end of the slides, and then we can kind of open up the back and forth a little bit more. I kind of talked about the backup and restore. Just here's a couple quick screenshots of what it kind of looks like. You can see the screenshot on the left is the installer that you execute off the ISO. So now instead of this big blue screen where you have, a couple of buttons, now we've got 4 different buttons and kind of a modernized UI. And then if you click restore, you can see on the right-hand side, we're deploying, going through stage 1, we're deploying a new OVF and we're giving it some information about where the backup configuration is so that once it gets to the end of stage 1, it can start importing that data for the restore. So pretty simple process.
By the way, I'll be showing a lot of this next week. So I'll walk through the backup restore.
Sweet. So kind of the last thing before we get to vCHA and the whiteboard is clients. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but I think it's still important to just reiterate where we are, where we're going, and just try to instill some confidence that we are moving in the right direction and we are listening to our customer base. So here's the landscape that we're at right now, right? There's 5 different ways to manage the vSphere infrastructure. 5 is way too many, right? Ideally, we'd want 1. We're marching in that direction. We'll probably always have at least 2. We'll probably have a separate host client and a separate vCenter client. And then we're working on ways to condense this down further, integrating the PSC UI and the appliance management UI and some other things. So long term, we'll definitely see this landscape get smaller. But for now, this is kind of the reality, right? We do have the web client, the vSphere web client that's based on Adobe Flex and Flash. We have made a significant number of improvements in 6.5. We're getting rid of it, right? But at the same time, we just can't completely abandon it because it's nowhere near where it needs to be. But it's gotten a lot better in 6.0, and it's gotten even better in 6.5. I'm not gonna pretend to say that like you're gonna install 6.5 and just sing the praises of the vSphere web client all day long all of a sudden. But from everybody I've talked to, even some very big cynics, people who have just outright refused to use it, they've said that it is manageable and they're able to use it as their daily driver in 6.5. So it's very encouraging, especially since we've added things like live refresh. One of the biggest challenges has been the web client hasn't been the single source of truth, right? You've got multiple administrators or you've got multiple things going on in the environment. Having to mash that refresh key or just, having the CSharp client running in the background so you can get that real-time status of what's going on in the environment really kind of crippled adoption in a lot of ways. So having live refresh in 6.5 I think is going to make a big difference, right? That's not solving all the problems, but it is one of the big things that has been solved. And then we got rid of the client integration plugin. So now we have this very lightweight plugin called the Enhanced Authentication plugin that you only need if you're doing pass-through Windows authentication or smart card authentication. If you don't care about those 2 things, you don't have any plugins to worry about or to install. So that's another positive. Also, performance across the board has been increased. And I could go on for a while, but you get the gist. We've made some improvements to sort of help customers, help our users bide their time until the future is here, right? And speaking of that future, we've got the vSphere client. This is kind of confusing. I've seen this on social media already, kind of cause some people to scratch their heads a little bit. I think vSphere client is the right name in the long term for this HTML5 based web client, but a lot of people still call the CSharp client the vSphere client, and so that's causing some confusion. So we're trying to do our best to mitigate that, and I'll call this the HTML5 vSphere client a lot of times. You know, so just so you know, if you see different terminology, that's why. But it's all fully HTML5 based. It's been a fling for almost a year now. We just released version 2.20, 2.20 today. We've been on a weekly cadence. We missed a couple weeks over the holidays here, but pretty much every week we've released a new version of this fling. And so you can kind of get a sense from that if you go back and look through the fling page of just the comments to see the interest, and then look through the change logs, the changes we're making on a weekly basis. The development speed has been pretty great. You know, not trying to toot the team's horn or anything, but I mean, it's been pretty amazing to see this thing take shape. And we've been doing it in a very public way to make sure that we're capturing all that feedback in real time and integrating that feedback to the product as quickly as we can. The last thing that we want to do is come back out with another web interface that customers detest and hate with as much vile as they did the vSphere web client, right? So we want to make sure that when we released the 6.5 version of this, it was in a good spot, and then it's going to continue to get better over the course of this year. And hopefully, I don't want to get myself into trouble by talking about timelines, but hopefully over the course of this year, and maybe into the beginning of next year, we'll see the vSphere client become the one client that you need to use to manage vCenter, right? And then we'll finally deprecate and bury, and we can all have a party when we can finally get rid of the Flash client. So enough about that. I guess I'll pause here just to take any questions about the management interfaces.
All right, so will the HTML5 client work back with ESXi 5.5?
So the HTML5 vSphere client is for vCenter. So if your vCenter can manage 5.5 hosts, then yes, technically it will work. But I think the spirit of the question was along the lines of how can I manage my hosts? And with 6.0 Update 2, we introduced the ESXi host client. So if you go to the FQDN or IP of your host /UI, you'll get this nice, rich HTML5 interface. I don't know if the Fling worked back into the 5X family. I don't think that it did.
No, it did not.
So if you're still running 5X hosts, you're still stuck using the C# client until you get your vCenter and your hosts up level to 6.
Graham, even vCenter is not going to work with the HTML5. You'll have to be at least on 6.0 or go to 6.5.
Yep.
Let's see. Okay. Any way to attach a local ISO file with the vSphere web client or vSphere client? I'm having to use Workstation 12 to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. One way would be to use the VMRC, but if you, if the ISO file is local on your machine, VMRC or Workstation or Fusion would be the way to do that. If the ISO is stored on a data store somewhere, then you can do that right through the native UI of either of the clients. Well, I don't know if it's in the H5 client yet, but certainly vSphere web client. But if it's local, try VMRC is another way to do it.
And last question is, since VCSA is now Photon-based, will we be able to log in as root and add things like NetApp file storage plugins or other vendor plugins?
I mean, the answer is no. And the reason, I'll explain why in a minute, but I'd be curious to understand why we'd want to do that. Like, what would the vendor gain from having their plugin installed on the appliance in that way. Typically, what we would do is we would register a plugin via the APIs, and within the vCenter application, it doesn't really need a package to be installed into the appliance itself. I know there's some plugins that require a Windows install, things like that, but really there should be a different mechanism that the plugin is installed via the APIs in the web client versus doing a package install on the appliance.
Just to add to that, if you are running, because I'm starting to see more jump in, Dell Open Manage, QLogic, anything like that, you're still going to have to run on Windows. If you install it on the appliance, if you happen to install anything on the appliance and you have an issue and you call GSS, they will tell you to uninstall it before they can proceed.
Yeah, so I think it's a couple of things to add. One, we need to get to a place where we've got a certification framework for plugins. One of the things we've seen is, plugins for vSphere are kind of the Wild West, right? You can have 10 plugins deployed, and one of those plugins could just completely take down the entire system, and you don't know which plugin it is. You don't really have a good way to troubleshoot, and so we've added some things under the covers, like a safe mode, and some other things that we can in a whitelist, blacklist system. But what we're trying to get to is a plugin certification program, so that these vendors that are requiring, a Windows install, we may not be able to get 100% away from that, but if we can get away from that type of plugin with the vendors, then we'll do our best to work with them and provide the framework to allow them to rewrite their plugins to take advantage of our new plugin framework, as opposed to requiring you to run a separate Windows box.
Yeah, so now it's getting, so do we need to run a standalone box going forward rather than running them on vCenter Server? And the answer is yes. If they require Windows, then yeah, you're going to have to do that.
Yeah, and let us know what plugins are requiring you to do that, because that will help us prioritize working with those vendors to get them to, come over to the light side and redo that.
And to answer this one really quick, so vCHA is an exclusive feature only to the vCenter Server appliance. So if you want to go to the Windows-based vCenter Server, that feature won't be there. In regards to using linked mode, mixed, and when I say mixed, I mean you have an appliance and you have a Windows vCenter Server. Yeah, I mean you can do that, but the recommendation would be to stay on a standard platform. So appliance or Windows would be preferred.
Yep. So I think you glossed over. No, I think you answered all of them. Yeah, you answered all of those, right?
There's more coming in. Is there SNMP management connectivity for monitoring systems to connect to the VCSA?
Yep, absolutely. We've supported SNMP since the VCSA was first launched. So there's a couple of KBs out there that have all the OIDs. And I know there was a bug with 6.0 Update 2, I think, or Update 1 with SNMP, but that's certainly been resolved in 6.5, and you can fully use SNMP to monitor.
I think you mentioned earlier that I hope you mentioned earlier that using the CSharp Client with vSphere 6.5 will not work, right?
That is correct. I know some of you on the line probably have figured this out by now, so I'll just address it. if you try to use the C# client to connect to vCenter 6.5, you will get an error. You will not be able to connect. However, if you use the C# client to try to connect to an ESX host 6.5, you will be able to successfully connect and log in and manage your host. That is sort of a unintentional loophole, let's say, because to close that loophole, we would need to make code changes to the C# client itself, and trying to do that when we've basically shot it dead and buried it is next to impossible. So that's going to stay there for now, but we are working on ways to, it may be ugly, to be completely honest, how we close that loophole, but we will prevent, or we're working on ways to prevent the C# client from connecting to the host because it's completely unsupported. There has been no code changes to the C# client since 5.5, and there are just some things that could really cause problems using that client to manage a newer host. I'm sure there's probably still more questions coming in, but we're already 30 minutes in, so let's keep the train rolling, and then maybe we can circle back to some of the questions, or get some of them addressed as I move along. I'm almost to the end of the slides, and then we'll get to the whiteboard. Let me get my mouse back. Here we go. So I kind of already beat this horse to death, but there is a couple points that I did want to make yet. Is that basically what happened with 6.5? We released a fully supported version of the H5 client. It's running about 2.6 of the Fling, or equivalent to that code. So it's quite a bit older than the Fling. We'll still publish and develop on the Fling. All the new features will go to the Fling first, and then we'll have a way to, we'll probably release an update to the fully supported version, built into vCenter, probably on a quarterly basis. So look for the first update to the H5 client, the GA version, probably sometime this quarter or next few months. Here's a couple links. I didn't want to save this to the end because a lot of times, especially when I'm switched over to the whiteboard, I never come back to PowerPoint. So just in case that happens, here's a couple links. We have a set of launch blogs. They're pretty high level, easy reading, even though there's quite a few of them. That's a good place to start if you're looking at 6.5. We've also got the feature walkthroughs. I think we've got 22 or 23 of them out already. And we're still working on some blog posts to go along with some of them, but you can go and peruse those click-by-click walkthroughs on like how to deploy the appliance, how to migrate, how to replace certificates, how to enable vCenter HA, those kinds of things. And then you can listen to a modernized recording. The VMworld recording website is a little weird, so I wasn't completely confident I had a valid link that I could share. Plus, it was so long, it would be tough for you all to type in. So just search for INF 9047 on the VMworld Europe replay site, and you can replay an hour session about the appliance in 6.5 that Ahmad and I did back in October. And then we've got the posters. They're currently based on 6.0. A lot of the same information applies, but we are trying to get them updated for 6.5. There's some other higher priority things right now going on, but we're going to do our best to get those posters updated because we know people like them. All right, so I've got a couple slides on vCenter HA, and then we'll just move over to the whiteboard. A couple of things. This is an active-passive solution. It is also an availability solution. It is not called vCenter Disaster Recovery. It is called vCenter High Availability. This is not an orchestration tool to replace SRM or even compete or do any of the same things that something like SRM or Zerto or what have you would do. This is simply a way to make vCenter more highly available, and it's targeted toward with being used and deployed within a site or within a data center, right? There are some flexibilities built in, and I'll get to it. And I know I've seen some questions come across about putting the active node in one data center and the passive node in another. We'll get to that, and maybe why that might make sense for some, but not for a lot of others. But the core principles of this solution is we wanted something easy to deploy. All right. If you look at layering vCenter on top of something like Windows Server failover clusters, it's very complicated. It's not well documented, and it's just not a very elegant solution. Plus, it requires things like physical mode RDMs, which no one, well, I shouldn't say no one, but I don't think many people should be deploying PRDMs anymore. But we also can do things like we don't live within the construct of a cluster anymore. So if you look at, I get the question a lot of, well, how is this better than like vSphere HA, right? Well, vSphere HA requires shared storage, right? Requires multiple hosts connected to the same backend. This, we don't require that. We could have 3 hosts all with their own local storage, and we can completely run vCenter HA off those 3 hosts without a problem. If we're looking at cross-cluster or expanding the footprint of where we're placing these nodes, we're not limited to be within a cluster, right? We can put one node in a cluster that's in one room, and we can put the passive node in a cluster in another room, and we can put the witness on a standalone host under somebody's bed. It's completely flexible. So those are really the tenets that we use to build this solution. And then we also wanted to make it easy to manage. So it's all built into the web UI. There's not a separate interface to manage it. We've also got alerting, when there's a failover happens, and all that kind of stuff. So simplicity is you'll see and hear a lot when we talk about vCenter HA. So let's get into the nuts and bolts, right? I think that's why most of us are here. We've got 2 Ethernet interfaces. We've got the first one, ETH0. That's your normal interface that vCenter or any VM for that matter is using out of the gate, right? So what we do when we enable vCenter HA is we add a secondary VM NIC, right? ETH1 in this particular case, that's what we call it, Ethernet adapter 1. So this Ethernet adapter 1 creates this vCenter HA network. Just think of it as a cluster heartbeat network, or just a private network that these nodes use to communicate. There's no special requirements about this other network. The only requirement is that, well, I guess there's 2 requirements really. One is that we only require layer 3 connectivity on this network, so it's not layer 2. And we also require it to be separate, a separate network segment than the primary vCenter interface. So if your vCenter is running on 10.1.1.100 on a /24, we would require the HA network to be anything other than 10.1.1.0/24.
Hey Adam, real quick question: how much bandwidth does it need? Can it use the FT network?
So you could absolutely use the FT network if you wanted to, if you have a limited number of VLANs. One of the things that we don't require for this network is we don't require a VM kernel port. So vMotion, FT, storage traffic management, those all require VM kernel ports, right? For this, all we require is a separate port group with a separate VLAN, or at least a separate network segment. So the short answer is yes, you could use the FT network or any of the other networks except the management network, but just create a port group and tag a VLAN that you have available. As far as bandwidth goes, you can take a look at there's a vCenter HA performance and best practices white paper. I think that's the exact title of it. It's pretty easy to find on blogs.vmware.com or just a Google search. But that talks about bandwidth, and basically the gist of it is, even at our environments at scale, 10,000 VMs or 25,000 VMs, whatever we tested, there's not a significant amount of bandwidth that is required between the two nodes. Nothing that a 10 gig link couldn't handle. If you're running 10 gig in your data center, great, you're good. Shouldn't be any worries no matter what your scale is. If you're running 1 gig still, or maybe you only have 1 gig links available to you, might require some testing. I think they used exact numbers in that white paper though, so I'll just defer to that because I don't have that memorized. The key thing though, much more important than bandwidth, is latency. So we require 10 milliseconds or less of round-trip latency in between each of these nodes. So we've got two types of replication going on that you can see that are traversing this vCenter HA network. We use the native PostgreSQL synchronous replication mechanisms to replicate the database data. And then we also use rsync, a Linux-based asynchronous solution to replicate some key configuration files, in certificates and stuff like that that live on the file system. And typically those files are very small, hundreds of kilobytes, maybe a few megabytes. And so it's an asynchronous rep technology, like I mentioned, but typically when changes are made to those files, they're replicated over within, less than a second or two, because those deltas are very small, because the files themselves are typically very small. Just a couple key points about the solution, and we'll get to the whiteboard and maybe kind of take some more questions as I'm drawing things out, and kind of solidify what happens during a failover scenario, what happens with an embedded PSC versus external PSC, try to address that metro cluster question, things like that. So I kind of already talked about some of this stuff, but just to kind of drive home the point, we wanted to hit all the marks we could with this solution, right? If you look at something like Windows failover cluster, separate management, it was only within a data center, required shared storage. You look at something like vSphere HA, fairly simple to manage and deploy, but it did require shared storage, and it's a cluster level construct, so we couldn't fail a VM over from one cluster to another, right? So those are all advantages that our vCenter HA solution has over the other failover mechanisms. So let me kill this and switch over. All right.
So can the HA vCenters be FT as well?
Why? I guess would be my initial question.
Yeah.
Not to be like flippant, because it's a valid question, but you wouldn't get any value out of that. At least none that I can think of.
You would actually put more overhead than anything.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Interesting question though, but the other thing with FT, right, is you're limited at 4 vCPUs. So if you have anything other than a tiny, or maybe small as 4 vCPU as well, you have anything other than that, I mean, you've kind of ruled yourself out for FT as well.
Another question about what happens if the other two nodes fail, can the witness take over? You're going to show that during the whiteboard.
Yeah, let's just draw that out right now. So I'll kind of draw a very similar picture to what I just had.
As you're drawing,
you can see my whiteboard, right?
Yeah, I'm just going to answer a few questions. Can vCHA nodes be thin provisioned? Yeah, that has nothing, no effects. You can thick provision or thin provision as normal.
Oops, can't spell. Okay, so let's go through some failure scenarios real quick, and then we'll dive deeper into the rabbit hole. So a couple things, right? This is a cluster technology that is similar to other clustering technologies in that we have to build in some protection mechanisms. And what I mean by that is, what if our network becomes isolated, right? Well, that's what the witness is here for, right? The witness can establish quorum and can say, okay, even though the active now can't talk to the passive, the witness can talk to both of them, and he knows that the active is still online, still good to go, so nothing happens. The cluster is in a degraded state at this point. Let me do this. Let me erase that line there. So let's say that active and passive cannot talk to each other. So we're in a degraded state, right? If the active fails while we're in a degraded state, let me see if I can okay, that's a stop sign looking symbol, degraded state, right? So if the active were to fail, right, we would not be able to automatically fail over to the passive node while we're in this degraded state, all right? Again, it's a protection mechanism because not all the pieces are functioning correctly, and we wouldn't want to fail over to a failed node or a node that's not working correctly, or cause a complete failure in the process of failing over. So we need a completely healthy cluster in order to have an automatic failover. Now let's say that this link here that's down between the active and passive, let's say that that's due to some regular maintenance or something that's expected, right? So we do have the option to go into this passive node and do a force failover. We can do that. We would do that via the command line in this case, because vCenter itself, the application, would be down. So we would just SSH or console into the passive node. We would run a vCHA command to force the failover, and the passive node would become active. And then basically once we could do some troubleshooting now on the old active node if we needed to, or just destroy it and redeploy. And then once our link comes back up, then we go back into a healthy state. This guy becomes, well, let's do this. This guy becomes the new passive, right? This guy is the new active, and we're good to go. Now, if I remember right, one of the questions was, well, can the witness ever serve as the active node, or a passive node for that matter? And the answer is no. The witness node will never do anything other than be a witness node. So what we do, there's a couple different ways to deploy vCenter HA. One is what we call the basic. That's kind of the big red easy button to deploy. We do a bunch of stuff for you in deploying and setting this up. And then there's the more advanced option. But in either of those options, the witness is a straight clone of the original vCenter appliance, right? If we're doing the basic config, then we go ahead and resize this guy to 1 vCPU and 1 gig of RAM. If we're doing the advanced, we rely on you to do that. But otherwise, we're basically setting the expectation that this is a low I/O type of machine. It's not in the data path. It will never be anything more than the witness. Any other questions coming in that I can quickly address before moving on?
Can we do the failover via PowerShell remotely?
There are some PowerShell commandlets. I haven't familiarized myself a whole lot with them yet, but I think William Lamb, if you look on his blog, I think he's posted about it. I think mostly now they're read-only, if I remember right, or read type of things like what's the status of this node, what's the status of the cluster, those types of things. But we'll definitely, I think people are working on adding functionality to work with that. But the other thing that you have to think about is if vCenter is down, PowerShell isn't going to do you much good, right? Unless you're doing something like calling an SSH script to SSH into one of the nodes and run that force failover command or something like that. So there's some definitely possibilities there. We don't have them all there yet, though. So one of the important things that I want to make sure we get to before we run out of time is this whole, how does vCenter HA work with the PSC, right? Hopefully, I'm just going to assume everybody is quasi-familiar with the Platform Services Controller and the role it plays. If you're not, I guess pause now and go read up on the PSC and then come back. But basically, vCenter HA can work with both an embedded, well, I don't need to draw this. I've already drawn it. Both an embedded PSC. So let's assume that we've got this topology here, right? And so remember that each of these nodes are clones of each other. So this PSC is copied over to this other node during that clone process. So it's kind of a passive node PSC, if you will. Its configuration is being replicated via that rsync mechanism, right? So everything that's changing in the SSO domain, which honestly isn't a whole lot most of the time, that's all being replicated via rsync. And so when we do have a failure, the PSC role as well will fail over, because it's an embedded PSC, and become active on the new active node, right? So it's all kind of tightly integrated and all just is there and all just kind of works, right? Now the next evolution is, well, let me take this time to remind everybody that with 6.5, we can no longer do enhanced linked mode with an embedded PSC, right? That was something that you could do in the 5X days, something that you could do in 6.0. We deprecated it in 6.0, and now in 6.5 we've said you can no longer do it. So just take that to heart, that if you want to do enhanced linked mode, you need to do an external PSC, at least at this point in time, with 6.5. So how does that look like, or what does that look like? So let me draw a couple PSCs. Well, let me just draw one PSC, right? I've got a vCenter that's enabled for HA. Let's use APNW for active passive witness. I've got my network down here, and I've got this primary interface where right now my users are hitting that IP address and they're getting served via that interface on the active node. The PSC, these vCenters are sort of registered in this way. The active node is absolutely registered to that PSC. The reason I drew a dotted line for the passive node is it's not really using that link at this point in time, right? It's passive. Really what it's concerned about is this replication going on down here, right? When it becomes the active node, then yes, absolutely, it will start communicating directly with that PSC. Now, my question to you all is this: if I've gone through the trouble to make this part of my infrastructure highly available, is there much of a reason to leave this single point of failure up here? Hopefully you're all thinking, of course not, Adam. Why would I ever do that? If you are thinking that, good. If you're not thinking that, well, maybe reconsider and think about that. I would say that it doesn't make much sense to use a single PSC and have a single point of failure when you've just gone through the work to eliminate a different single point of failure. So let me clean this up a little bit. So really what we're saying, and if you read the documentation, we're saying this is required, is that you need to put a pair of PSCs behind a load balancer, right? So we've got a VIP here, and then we register vCenter to the VIP, right? Rudiment, one-on-one information. For load balancers, we support NSX, F5, and NetScaler. But the idea here is that now you've eliminated all the single points of failure for your PSC and your vCenter infrastructure, right? Couple of key things here. We've got something called an SSO site that these PSCs are within. We've also got something called a SSO domain that these PSCs are a member of, right? And now what happens when I want to extend this idea to a second data center, right? So I've got another pair of PSCs I'm going to deploy. I've got another set of vCenter, vCenter appliances I'm going to deploy. I've got my load balancer here, my VIP. Now I've got, let me choose a different color. Sure, yellow. And I've got an SSO site over here in my second data center. And then I've still got the same SSO domain, right, over here. So now I've got enhanced linked mode across both of these vCenter instances, right? So when I log into the vCenter, I see both of these vCenters in the web client. I've got shared licensing. If you're not familiar with enhanced linked mode, there's a plethora of information out there about it. You can read up on it. But essentially what this gives us now is a very simple architecture that we can kind of stamp across our different data centers. And then if we want to go again to a third data center, a fourth data center, a fifth data center, we can just stamp this out in each of those sites. So any questions specifically on that before I move on to one of my last points and then just, I guess, kind of open up for Q&A?
Just go ahead, and then we got a bunch of questions varying from different things. So just wrap up, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. Okay,
cool. So one of the last things, and this isn't necessarily specific to vCenter HA, but it is important when we're talking about multi-site and enhanced linked mode and external PSCs. So if we look at this from a replication perspective, these two PSCs are replicating with each other. These two PSCs are replicating with each other. That's a requirement for a pair of PSCs behind a load balancer. And then depending on how you deployed this third PSC, you may have chosen to replicate it with PSC number 1, let's say. These are 1, 2, 3, and 4. But ideally, what we would recommend is that you do a replication topology like this. So when you're deploying PSC3, you tell it, you give it the FQDN of PSC2 to replicate with. And this creates this linear replication topology, all right? There's one problem with this, and that's when, let's say that PSC2 fails, right? That causes kind of a split brain scenario in that our site 2 over here, if this is 1, site 2 lost its link to replicate with site 1. So now we've got split brain, right? So how we get around that is we add a replication link from the last PSC in the stack to the first, right? There's a tool called VDC rep admin that we can use to manually do that. So now what that does is creates this nifty ring, and we don't have this split brain scenario any longer. We can have this situation where I've got PSCs all deployed, and I've all pointed them back to this uber mega awesome original PSC like this, right? We call that a hub and spoke. But again, if that middle PSC fails, if that uber PSC fails, I got a big problem, right? And you could say, well, I can create a mesh like this, and now, you know, any one of these could fail and I'm still good to go. But we don't want you to do that, because if you create this mesh and then you're going to add another PSC, oh, well, okay, I'll replicate him here. Maybe I'll go replicate him here. Maybe I'll go, no, I don't want to replicate him over here. I want to go over here. Then I'm going to add this PSC over here. Well, now who do I replicate him with? And so you can kind of see where I'm going with this. It creates this hugely complicated mess that you have to maintain every time you add a PSC, which doesn't make sense. You're not gaining any value from that.
Hey, Adam, can you move your little audio bar down at the bottom? It's actually blocking.
Oh, yeah. All right. I didn't even notice. I can't move them off the screen. So anyway, we don't want you to do that. It's overly complex. You don't gain any value from it. Keep it simple, right? Add one replication partnership at the end to create the ring, and you're good to go. So now that we've gone through the hour, I've got plenty of time. I don't know about you, Ahmad, but you know, we'll just kind of start rifling through questions and see how far we can get. And can we even like unmute people so they can speak up over the phone as well?
We can do whatever we want. I'll leave it up to you. I mean, we already got a bunch of questions here. Do we want to answer them first before we start unmuting?
Yeah, sure. Let's try to answer a few more of the typed in questions.
All right. Are other load balancers like A10 going to be certified or supported for PSC-HA in the future? I haven't heard anything. Today we support NSX, F5, and NetScaler. I mean, I'll be candid. There's nothing prohibiting you from using an A10. It's just when you call GSS for support and they see that, they're going to tell you it's not supported. But I haven't heard anything in regards to other load balancers being supported in the future.
The other piece to that that I'll add, and you know, if you listen to any of the VMworld sessions that, well, the VMworld US sessions that Ahmad and I presented, you may have heard us talk about this native HA feature for the PSC that didn't make it into the release. That still remains a goal long term. I wouldn't. You can look at it two ways, right? You can say, oh, I don't use those 3 supported load balancers. When is my load balancer going to be supported? But I would argue the better way to look at it is, when is VMware going to deliver a solution that doesn't even require a load balancer in the first place? So that's where I would, you know, worry about for the future. I don't know, because we're trying to eliminate the load balancer in there. I don't think that we're, like Ahmad was saying, I don't think we're going to go through the trouble of trying to certify additional ones when we're trying to eliminate it from the equation altogether.
And to be honest, you know, the load balancer does add more complexity just to your build process, but also from a troubleshooting perspective. Remember, I mean, all the load balancer is doing is basically doing a automated failover versus a repoint, which is a manual failover. So unless you have like a hard requirement of high availability, let's say, you know, 5 nines or something like that, I would keep it simple and just do the manual repoint. All right. With those two, HA vCenters need 2 licenses. So when you deploy a vCenter server and you enable vCHA, that's just 1 license. That's how it works. It doesn't require the active node and the passive node are under one license umbrella with the witness. You don't need a separate license for each one. Sorry, Adam, I know I'm jumping in answering these questions.
No, by all means. Give me a chance to drink some water.
Let's see. What happens if link between sites comes down? I was meaning if you had a linked pair.
I think I'd like some more clarification on that, but in general, if going back to the drawing I have on my screen, right? If we get rid of this red X, if this link goes down in between the two sites, both of these sites continue to operate, can continue to operate independently. The way that the enhanced link mode and the SSO domain works is that if a PSC fails, it only affects the vCenters that are registered to it, right? So again, if we kind of go over here and let's fail PSC1, right? Well, let's fail both of these PSCs since they're in an HA pair, right? Then that's going to affect this vCenter instance, right? I'm not going to be able to log into that vCenter, but this vCenter instance over here is going to continue to operate normally. You'll see an error in the web client that says, hey, I can't talk to this vCenter instance over here, but that'll be the extent of it. I hope that was the spirit of the question.
Yeah. You just won't be able to authenticate. That's really what it comes down to. HA proxy supported?
No, just like with A10 and other load balancers, we only fully support NSX, F5, and NetScaler.
The vCHA, does it do anything for HA on your content library?
So content library is just another vCenter construct. So the short answer again is yes. Content library will fail over with vCenter instance because it's part of the vCenter instance. Now, remember that the actual data is not stored within the content library, right? The data is stored on an external data store somewhere. So the data itself is going to stay put, but the metadata that that exists as the content library will be part of that vCenter instance and be part of this failover process.
Okay. So if you look at the drawing that Adam has, this is answering one of the licensing questions. He's got two different sites, one on the right, one on the left. The site on the right will have a vCHA license, and then the one on the right, because it's a separate deployment, will also have a vCHA license. Or really, vCHA comes with your vCenter server license, so it's basically per vCenter.
Yeah, per vCenter instance. So again, this, let's say mixed colors, but this is a vCenter instance, right? And this is a vCenter instance. So this would require two vCenter server standard licenses. Hopefully that's clear.
Let's see. Yes, so vCHA is not a thing for Windows vCenter. It is exclusive only to the vCenter Server Appliance starting with 6.5.
Yes,
so if you're currently running a Windows vCenter server, in order to get to where you could use vCHA, you would have to use the migration tool, and the migration tool will allow you to go from Windows vCenter Server 5.5 or 6.0 and get to a VCSA 6.5, and once you're on 6.5, then you can 6.5 VCSA, then you can enable vCHA.
I knew you were going to work in a migration plug. I knew it. But just to expand on that, some of the other features that we talked about at the beginning, native backup and restore, appliance monitoring, and VUM integration, those are things that are I guess VUM integration is arguable, but those features are features that you only get with the appliance. VUM integration, it's already integrated into the Windows install, so we're at parity with that one. But the others, HA, native backup and restore, and monitoring are all things that are exclusive for the appliance. So I guess the other big takeaway from that is now the appliance is more feature rich than Windows. So 6.0, we were at parity minus VUM. Now we've exceeded the feature set of Windows, and from a scalability and performance perspective, we beat the crap out of Windows.
You're jumping right into my session next week, man. You're just taking everything on my thunder.
Well, we can just knock it out right now, and then you take a break next week.
Yeah, but then I can't do the line migration. Anyway, back to these questions. All right, so there's a couple of latency questions. What's the latency requirement between sites?
So we probably need to answer this from an HA perspective and from an SSO domain perspective. Take it away.
So from an SSO,
answer this.
So I'm gonna be a little political on this one, because after we've mentioned a few things during VMworld, the numbers weren't there. So to answer the question, we currently do not publish any latency numbers between sites. But keep in mind that the PSC is similar to a directory service. So you want low latency as much as possible.
I'll take it slightly further. I think Ahmad and I are trying as best we can to get numbers to be published. But as we're fighting that battle internally, one of the things we've discovered is that really anything over 50 milliseconds between vCenters, you need to do some testing, because there's going to be more than likely some performance degradation. Now, this is certainly something that we get to answer with it depends, because I talked to a customer in Barcelona that says that, I don't remember exactly where their locations were, but they had like Singapore, India, US, South America, and they were doing one big SSO domain, and they were perfectly happy with it. But I've talked to other customers that have had data centers on, West Coast and London, arguably not that far away in the grand scheme of things of a global organization, and they thought it was terrible. So while that latency was less than what this other customer had from West Coast to India, it was acceptable. The performance degradation was acceptable for one customer versus another customer. So I would just say anything over 50 milliseconds, do some testing, see if what you have to deal with is acceptable or not, and then make a judgment call based on that. The other guideline that I would give you is, at least today, with the products that we have out, 6.0 and 6.5, I would probably opt to do some sort of regional SSO domains, something like North America, South America, Europe, APJ, an SSO domain in each of those regions, because once you get over 50 milliseconds, I think most people are going to see some sort of degradation that they're not going to be happy with. So that's not the greatest thing that we can, or not the most ideal answer we can provide, but it's just kind of the reality that we're living in today. And then Ahmad and I are trying to do our best to work with engineering to make it better.
I would say stay tuned. I didn't want to provide numbers because if we provide a number again and it changes, then it looks bad on us. But stay tuned. We are pushing to try to get you guys an answer in regards to the latency number. Okay, so that takes care of between sites. between two sites running PSC. That one is the same thing. Okay, what is the latency requirements for PSC over a WAN? We just answered that. You want to touch base on the latency requirements for vCHA?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, but it's really simple. 10 milliseconds round trip latency between all three nodes. We're trying to make engineering see the light, and this witness node that doesn't sit in the data path doesn't really make sense to require that to be within 10 milliseconds. And they're open to that, and I think it's just going to require a little more testing. But certainly between the active and passive, we need 10 milliseconds because of that synchronous replication that's happening at the database. Anything over than 10, you're going to see a significant reduction in performance because we got to wait till those database writes are acknowledged on the remote side before the application will move forward.
All right. Sounds like the bottom line is that the Windows vCenter server is going to be the same way as the CSharp Client in the future. I will say this. VCSA is VMware's direction, and all new features going forth will be only for the VCSA. So take that for what it's worth. Is there a way to move from a standalone 5.5 to a standalone 6.5 vCenter without doing an upgrade other than remove to add inventory so we can start clean? If you're asking that if you have a Windows vCenter server 5.5, is that the question, or are you doing VCSA 5.5 to VCSA 6.5? Need a little bit more clarification there. Okay, so Windows is a starting point. Yeah, so if Windows is a starting point, what you can do is you can actually run the migration tool, and during the migration process, you have the option to bring over your historical and performance data. Just don't bring that over. And what that does is it migrates your configuration, your inventory, and your alert data, and you start fresh, just like you would if you were deploying it manually, because we will deploy a vCenter Server Appliance for you and do all the heavy lifting. This is something I'm actually going to be covering next week, so we can discuss this a little bit further. But yeah, you can use the migration tool to do this, and you can start fresh if you don't select those options. How are Linux vulnerabilities addressed on the VCSA, such as the recent Suite 32 vulnerability?
Yeah, so if you, again, kind of harping back to what I said early on, is now that we control the operating system, it's going to take us far less time to develop patches or integrate downstream patches into the operating system and get that through our interop testing and everything and get that out the door. I hesitate, again, just like Ahmad and I have done a few times now, to quote specific numbers because they change all the time, and what we have conversationally internally with PMs and engineering is very fluid. But let's say that we could have a patch for something like that developed in-house within a matter of days and then out to customers within a matter of weeks, versus if you look at like Heartbleed is just one example that I happen to remember because I've used it as an example for a long time, but I think it took 2.5 months or something like that to get the portfolio fully patched, and so we're talking about reducing that by at least half, if not more, with Photon OS.
I think we're down to a manageable, so we can start unmuting people if you'd like. So I would say raise your hand if you want to be unmuted and ask your question. Or heckle Adam, since I didn't get to heckle him. I'm being nice since I'm presenting next week.
Graham, to answer your question about scripts to set up a 6.5 lab, look at William Lamb's blog. He's got a whole bunch of stuff there to help automate a 6.5 lab setup. Anyone? Come on. Don't be shy.
I'll just start randomly unmuting people.
I thought we were going to go for at least 4 hours here. We're only 20 minutes over.
We could always just do the whole architecture thing again. Adam
I did
on his Mac, so he's using OneNote as the application, and this is iPad.
Yep. Graham, I think I forgot to come back to your stretch cluster question. So let's chew on that for a second. So if we've got, let's say, let's just make this super simple so at least I can grasp this in my mind. Let's say we've got a 4-node stretch cluster, 2 nodes on each side, a metro cluster. Unless you're talking about like stretch vSAN cluster, maybe it's similar, but if we've got 2 nodes on each side, what do we do with vCenter? I would say that first thought, it would be okay to have like the active node pinned to the 2 hosts on one side and the passive node pinned to the 2 nodes on the other side. It just it's manageability and complexity. You could completely rely on vSphere HA in conjunction with vCenter HA to worry about the node placement. But if you're really trying to protect against an entire site failure, then you're going to want to make sure that the active and passive nodes stay separate and live in their separate data centers, I think. Just kind of off the top of my head. With PSC2 and where by center 1 and 2 do you mean data center? Why do you have 3 PSCs? Or did you mean PSC 1 and 2? Oh, okay. I see what you're saying, I think. So you kind of want to cross, you kind of want to have this scenario where I've got my vCenters here and then a PSC over here and do something like this vCenter registered to this PSC and kind of something like that. So it's an interesting idea, not a bad idea at all, but sort of question like what value you're getting. Let me just draw this out for the
Actually,
others.
if you look at, I think Ryan Johnson's VVD, he's got something similar, but not quite like this.
Yeah, because I mean, if you have a total site failure, right? So like this thing just falls off the map. Now you've got a PSC and a vCenter that are both fully functional, but both completely down because their counterparts on the other side are gone. So I think it depends on what specifically you're trying to protect against. I don't think there's a whole lot of value if you're just trying to protect against site failure. I would I don't know. You may do something like, add a second PSC in each, and just point locally. Sorry, this looks like a Christmas diagram now. Um, and then, again, we're not protecting against site failure here, but at least if a PSC fails, we can repoint, within our local site to make sure that performance is as good as it can possibly be. Oh, and you're talking about splitting the vCenter servers as well, so now we're going to get really fancy. How can I draw this without making it a complete mess? So now we've got passive nodes here, and we've got witness nodes, which, let's just say are even at a third site. Yeah, I mean, you can do that. Again, what's your latency between the sites?
And he wants the
bandwidth do
PSC
you have?
behind a load balancer. He's asking for punishment now.
Okay, well, let's draw this out clean. Is it all layer 2 between the two data centers?
Two and three links.
if it's all layer 2, then technically you could have this LTM where I've got PSC1, right? These guys are in an SSO site together, and then there's a VIP, call that VIP1, and then we've got another pair of PSCs, PSC4, I don't know why my PSCs are getting smaller. These guys are replicating, and these guys are in their own SSO site and have this VIP number 2, right, that's tied. Sorry, I just made it a mess. Too lazy to switch colors, I guess. You could, and I guess let me make this clear, this is the site boundary, right? You could technically do that if you have L2, but what we don't support is if this load balancer is a GTM, a global traffic manager. So like we're load balancing between layer 3 networks. Hopefully that makes sense. But if it's an LTM, because everything is in the same layer 2 network, then technically you could do that. Again, I don't know, like personally, I wouldn't do it that way because I just feel like that's overly complex. I would just do, but I guess taking a step back for a minute, you're doing this stretch clustering and metro cluster for a reason. So there might be something that I'm not thinking about. But if we weren't doing the stretch clustering, I just absolutely wouldn't do this unless there was some specific requirement I had to meet. Dan, I'm not even going to acknowledge you. I don't even know you anymore. Okay, so what Graham is talking about is what he's trying to solve is that he wants to be able to lose an entire data center and have no effects. So I guess this is one way to do it. Again, as long as we have layer 2 across and we're doing LTMs and not GTM appliances or load balancers, it's possible to do. And that might be the only way to solve that or meet that requirement. So I think it's okay. Might need to chew on it a little bit more. I don't know, Ahmad, do you see any pitfalls?
So if each data center, let's say, is a site, the repointing across sites would probably be one of your pitfalls. Since we don't support
we wouldn't ever be repointing right? Because we've got a VC, and it's highly available, of course, and it's registered to this VIP.
Oh, okay.
And then you've got another set over here that are registered to this VIP. So, or sorry, I didn't draw this right. I'm going to have to use different colors here. So let's say that we've got this, and we've got this, and then our witness node out here somewhere. So we'll call this active 1, passive 1.
I guess when I think of losing a data center, I mean, that's completely gone. I was, for me, you have a bigger problem than is my VC up, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Because really, well, I guess the VIP can be sort of portable. If you truly do have the host capacity,
and in the add to this, I'm sorry, and in vCHA, I mean, I would assume, the inventory, you don't want it to be kind of like a DR scenario, so you want to make sure that you don't get yourself in that situation.
Well, I guess the thing is that, we've got this cluster of hosts down here, a single cluster that spans both sites. So as long as, we'll call this workload 2, workload 1, as long as if we lose, this entire set of infrastructure, as long as all of this workload can run over in this other data center, then I guess, yeah, now you have this guy becoming active 2, right? So now we've got 2 active vCenters. As long as this VIP, spans and can run over on this side, which I think it can. I just didn't draw it that way. I think it's okay in that situation. But again, like if you're not doing a stretch cluster, I don't think this makes sense at all. Because for what I think Ahmad was just saying is that it's great that your vCenter fails over, but if your hosts and your workload are still failed over in your smoking crater data center, it doesn't do you any good that vCenter is operational. Just out of curiosity, Graham, can you say how many VMs you have in your environment? Okay, cool. Interesting. Anybody else have questions? Or I guess, Graham, did we sufficiently destroy that horse? Okay, cool. Any other questions as we're starting to get into the latter hours? And feel free to speak up on the phone.
Or if you want to be unmuted, just raise your hand and we'll unmute you. So I did ping Kyle about PowerShell from alerts, and he said not directly. You could play around with it and have VC interact with VRO, then run the script. Same with having VROPS. It has to use VRO for the source of the script.
All right. Anybody else?
Oh, I see a hand up. All right. You're unmuted.
How are you? How are you guys? This is Jorge. About the latency between sites, what kind of performance degradation do you guys see or hear from customers that experience over 50 millisecond latency, other than inventory search, I imagine, and anything else?
Long login times, long time managing objects in the remote vCenter. You know, just doing things like right-clicking and edit settings to, you know, modifying tags and things like that.
Okay. Cool. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Anybody else? Jorge broke the ice.
Maybe I should just start randomly unmuting people. I see Rebecca's on here. Dan.
Well, we should be asking her to answer some of these questions.
I guess we answered all the questions.
Well, we tried anyway.
Either
Lots
that
of
or
good
they just fell
questions.
asleep. Going once,
Right.
going twice. Sold.
All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap it then. Let me just real quick. Let me just put up this slide. Make sure you come back next week, same bat time, same bat channel for a mod. And then we'll hopefully have somebody lined up by this time next week for HA and DRS, and then, you know, keep coming back for the rest of the 6.5 sessions. Hopefully it was useful. Appreciate everybody spending more than, you know, almost 100 minutes with us and asking all the questions. Really cool hanging out with you guys.
All right, you want to stop the recording?
No, I don't. I want to keep going. All right, stopping the recording.